Welcome to a day to never forget. Before we begin today's video, it is important to inform you that it contains descriptions of sexual abuse and human exploitation. We have made every effort to address this topic with the utmost care, but there are still impactful details in what will be discussed. Since the end of World War II, numerous conflicts have erupted around the world. Today, we witness yet another devastating war, this time in Ukraine, through television screens, the internet, and social media. While war can bring out acts of heroism, it also exposes the darkest side of humanity. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, more than any other recent conflict, has laid bare the brutality of war. For historians, this war revives the tragedies of World War II in the 21st century. Massacres, indiscriminate bombings, deliberate attacks on civilians, torture, filtration camps, the abduction of Ukrainian children to be assimilated as Russians, and countless cases of sexual violence, including elderly women, girls, boys, and wives forced to endure such crimes in front of their husbands. Unfortunately, atrocities like these have always been part of armed conflicts. However, in Europe, with its immense military power and cameras everywhere, we are witnessing these horrors in real time. For scholars of World War II, the war in Ukraine answers a frequently asked question: what was it like to live during World War II? The brutalities we see today make the events of 80 years ago feel more real and tangible. One of the darkest chapters of World War II was the tragedy of the so-called comfort women, a term used to soften the terrible reality these victims endured. Thousands of women and girls were kidnapped or coerced by the Japanese army and forced into sexual slavery to serve its soldiers. As with many war crimes, the word comfort was nothing more than a disguise to conceal one of the worst forms of human exploitation. Records of this system of abuse exist in various countries, including Japan, China, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. However, the available documents only tell part of the story, as Japan, to this day, avoids openly addressing the subject. Nevertheless, in recent decades, the country has begun to acknowledge the actions of its military, issuing apologies and offering financial reparations, although many survivors consider these measures insufficient. Time has passed, and most of the victims of this atrocity are no longer alive. However, the memory of their suffering remains ingrained in the national identity of the countries that were occupied by Japan during the war. Additionally, few of these women were able to fulfill their dream of starting a family, as the prolonged and brutal abuse left many of them sterile. This was not an intentional consequence, but rather a direct result of the repeated physical and sexual assaults they endured. For many, the trauma was so profound that they could not bear the thought of being close to another man. Among the many things that were taken from them, the inability to have children and grandchildren was one of the most painful losses. It is estimated that around 500,000 women were taken from their homes to serve Japanese soldiers. Most of them came from poor backgrounds with little to no access to education. Some were abducted directly from the streets, while others were still children who had not even reached puberty. Many were deceived with false promises of well-paid jobs in factories or offices in major cities or even in Japan. Unfortunately, the perpetrators of these atrocities were not only Japanese soldiers. Some victims were handed over by their own countrymen. Criminal gangs and traffickers acted as intermediaries, selling women and girls to the Japanese army in exchange for money. Some families, unaware of the truth, sent their daughters and sisters away, believing they were offering them a chance at a better future. A lesser-known aspect of this history is that some of these victims were, in fact, Japanese. The Japanese government of the 1930s and 1940s was deeply fascist and sought to impose an extreme ideal of masculinity on society, inspired by a distorted vision of samurai values. The abduction and exploitation of these women were not only about controlling foreign populations, but also reflected a war waged against Japanese women themselves. The Japanese term for comfort woman translates to something like woman who consoles, but the reality of these victims was one of pure suffering and dehumanization. This story became known thanks to the courage of the survivors, who spent decades fighting for recognition and justice. despite facing resistance. Their legacy and resilience ensured that this dark part of history would never be completely erased. Some comfort women, who were designated exclusively for high-ranking Japanese officers and officials, could receive slightly better conditions as long as they followed orders and satisfied their superiors. However, despite the bureaucratic terminology used by the Japanese, the words they actually used to refer to these women revealed their true perception of them. These victims included not only Asians and Japanese, but also a large number of European women, who were captured when the Japanese took control of former European colonies in Asia. The dehumanizing terms used to describe them range from expressions such as public toilet to official classifications that label them as units of war supplies. It is no surprise that many of these women and girls lost their lives during their time in captivity. Hunger, disease, brutal beatings, hemorrhages, and even executions for disobedience were among the most common causes of death. In many cases, those who were in critical condition were simply discarded, expelled from the makeshift shelters where they were confined and left to die alone in foreign lands. However, most did not survive long enough to reach that point, as they perished before being abandoned. In several locations, especially in the Philippines, kidnapped women and girls were forced to pay for their own medical treatments if they contracted sexually transmitted infections. However, since they received no payment for their forced exploitation, they had no means to afford medical care, sealing their fate of suffering and death. The stated purpose behind the comfort women system was supposedly to reduce the number of public rapes committed by Japanese soldiers in occupied territories. However, this measure was not driven by compassion or concern for the victims, but rather by the fear among Japanese officials that mass rapes could provoke revolts and resistance from the local population. To prevent this, the Japanese High Command organized the creation of so-called comfort stations, where women were held captive and subjected to systematic exploitation. Another factor that led to the establishment of these facilities was the attempt to control the spread of sexually transmitted diseases among Japanese troops. Initially, this strategy seemed to have some effect. However, as the U.S. Navy began destroying the Japanese merchant fleet, supplies of condoms and medicines became scarce. In many cases, women were forced to reuse wash condoms, a practice that clearly did not prevent the spread of infections. Moreover, many Japanese soldiers simply refused to use them, choosing instead to ignore the risks of contamination. As a result, by late 1943, venereal disease rates among Japanese troops increased even more than before the implementation of the comfort women system. The movie Paradise Road 1997 portrays with shocking realism the experiences of a group of European and Indonesian women captured on the island of Sumatra during World War II. One of the characters, after enduring severe abuse as a prisoner, accepts a proposal from the Japanese to work in the officers' quarters. Unlike many other victims, she understands exactly what is expected of her, but believes her role will be limited to one commander. At first, she receives new clothes and begins living in a more comfortable residence. However, she soon finds herself trapped in an even more horrific situation. The officer who was supposed to care for her brutally assaults her, and even worse, allows other soldiers to do the same. Shortly afterward, when the other prisoners see her again, she no longer recognizes them. Her vacant and distant stare reflects the deep psychological destruction she has endured, while the bruises on her face silently tell the story of yet another victim of the horrors of war. The vast majority of women subjected to sexual slavery never experienced any form of comfort or privilege. Contrary to what some may imagine, they did not live in beautiful homes or wear new clothes. Many were taken wearing only the clothes they had on at the time, or, at most, carrying a small suitcase, believing they were being recruited for work in an office or factory. When their clothes became tattered or torn, they might receive garments that had belonged to a deceased companion or, in some cases, were forced to wear a rough burlap sack, resembling a crude apron. This deceased companion could have died from disease, severe beatings, or even execution for being too weak to continue serving. Occasionally, Japanese soldiers responsible for the brutal murders of comfort women faced some form of punishment. However, these punishments rarely went beyond a simple reprimand or, in some cases, a reduction in rank. Only in very rare instances were some soldiers imprisoned for a short period. For many of those accused of killing a comfort woman, the most common punishment was being transferred back to Japan, if any punishment was issued at all. Beyond these inhumane conditions, many of these women were kept in comfort stations, located just behind battlefronts. This was especially true in China, where battles occurred continuously throughout the war, and in the Pacific, where combat was frequent. There are numerous images of British and Australian soldiers speaking with liberated women, documenting their testimonies and providing medical assistance. This was particularly common in Papua New Guinea, where many Japanese and Papuan women were victims of sexual violence. Some of these women were the daughters of Japanese businessmen who had worked in the region before the war. Many of these men returned to Japan without knowing or without caring that they had left daughters behind. One of the most tragic episodes of the Pacific War occurred during the American invasion of the Japanese colony of Saipan. At the end of the battle, Japanese soldiers and civilians were trapped on a narrow strip of land. Facing them were U.S. Marines, whom Japanese government propaganda had portrayed as cannibals and baby killers. Driven by panic, many civilians chose to jump from the cliffs, often holding their own children in their arms. However, not all jumped of their own free will. Among those who lost their lives were numerous comfort women. Some, convinced by propaganda, leaped out of irrational fear. Others were forced by Japanese soldiers, who pushed them with bayonets. Many of those who tried to hide were killed by grenades thrown by the very same Japanese soldiers, who preferred to take as many people with them in death. Some of these brutal events on the cliffs of Saipan were captured on film by U.S. Navy photographers. Although women and girls were abducted on a large scale across various nations, it is estimated that about 80% of comfort women were Korean. Korea had been under Japanese rule since 1896, and many were taken by force. One survivor, Kim Hak-sun, recounted her experience. When I was 17 years old, Japanese soldiers arrived in a truck, beat us, and threw us into the back. They told me that if I enlisted, I could earn a lot of money working in a textile factory. On the first day, I was raped, and the rapes never stopped. I was born a woman, but I never lived as one. I feel sick when I get close to a man, not just Japanese men, but all men, even my own husband, who saved me from a brothel. I shiver whenever I see the Japanese flag. Why should I feel ashamed? I have nothing to be ashamed of. She also revealed that she was raped between 30 and 40 times a day, every day of the year. As one might imagine, this caused unbearable physical pain, along with irreversible psychological and emotional trauma. When the war ended, many of these women returned home but never spoke about their experiences. Others never went back, unable to face their families after what they had endured. It was only in the 1980s that a significant number of survivors began to speak out, influenced by the feminist movement of the previous decades. Over time, their maturity and the pursuit of long-denied justice led these women to demand reparations and official recognition of the crimes committed by the Japanese government. However, this struggle was not easy. It took many years before Japan admitted its responsibility and agreed to offer compensation. And even then, the amounts were minimal. The pressure for Japan to fully acknowledge its actions came not only from the victims, but also from their children, grandchildren, and countries that had been Japan's enemies during the war. This eventually led the Japanese government to issue formal apologies and offer more substantial compensations. However, most of this money was allocated to organizations created to assist the survivors, and very few of them ever received direct payments. Today, it is believed that only a few dozen comfort women are still alive. Nevertheless, women's rights advocacy groups and other organizations continue to demand that Japan fully recognize this part of its history. In Seoul, South Korea, a statue called Peace was erected, depicting a comfort woman demanding justice. Over time, similar statues have appeared in various parts of the world, especially in front of Japanese embassies, including several in the United States. The Japanese government has repeatedly requested the removal of these statues, but most remain standing to this day. Thank you for following this presentation on such a tragic and significant topic. May we learn from history and work together to ensure that atrocities like this never happen again.